When you have a lot of data and you want to summarize it, maybe into a chart, Excel, pivot tables, and pivot charts are a great place to start. And let's back up. What are pivot tables? I'd like to take an example that is smaller. Let's imagine you're tracking expenses, $1,000 on rent. You went to Stop and Shop and spent $50 and another $20 on groceries. If you wanted to figure out where your money was going, you would want to categorize those expenses. So you had your rent of $1,000 and your groceries of $70. Now, the way this looks when you put everything in a spreadsheet is each row is some amount of money you spent for a certain category. So the rent of $1,000 and each of those separate groceries. Now, when you want to do a pivot table, if you're manually creating it, you put your categories one time only. So I'm not going to list groceries twice, just once. And then I would put each total expense for that category. So I'm going to add together my $50 and $20 in groceries, and I have my total. That's a pivot table, and Excel can do it for you in just a few clicks. I have a table here in an Excel spreadsheet. So I'm going to add a pivot table that looks at the expense type and the amount paid, and it summarizes that by adding up the amount paid by expense type. So to do that, I'm going to go to the Insert toolbar and I will select Pivot Table. And then it's going to say, what data do I want to use? And I want to use that table I created, the expense payments, and I want it in a new worksheet, and I'll click OK. Once I've done that, I'm going to see my pivot table editor. So on the right-hand side is a list of my pivot table fields, and then there is almost like a window pane on the bottom of the different places I can put those fields. So to start off, I am going to just check the amount paid fake. And when I do that, it automatically sends this to values because this is a numerical field, so it's summing them up, and I will automatically see a sum of all the values in the data. But I want to break this down. And when I want to break it down, if you remember when we made the table manually, we took that expense type and we put one on each row. So that's what we want to do here too. We want expense type to go into the rows area. Now I can take expense type and manually drag it into the rows section. Or you'll see when I select expense type, because of its data type, it's just a generic text field, it will automatically go to rows. And I will see my pivot table created in what, 2 clicks? Maybe there was 3 in there. Now in this case, it didn't make my sum of amount paid currency. So I can right click on one of the values in my pivot table, choose number format, and then I'm going to choose accounting. I don't need to see the decimal places, so I'll remove decimal places to 0, click OK, and I will see my numbers now. A couple things I can do with this. What if I want to see what percent each category makes up? I can do that by changing how this is shown. So what I'm going to do in my pivot table, I'm going to right click on one of the values under sum of amount, and under show values as, I'm going to choose percent of the column total. And when I do that, I will see all of my presents there. Now, the next thing that can be helpful to do is to reorder this. So I can click on the drop down near the top leftmost corner, and instead of just sorting alphabetically by my category, I want to choose more sort options. And then I want to sort descending. So I have the highest amount on the top, so I'll choose descending, and not expense type, but by sum of amount paid. And when I click OK, then it's easy for me to look at this and see what percent is going where. I'm going to undo that. So I go back to the values. And now let's talk about a couple ways to filter this. In my original data, I have dates, the payment date, and this goes from July in 2024 into the spring of 2025. So if I would like to add a filter by date, I'm going to click into my pivot table and go to Pivot Table Analyze tab, and I'm going to choose Insert Timeline. Because in my table, the payment date is formatted as a date, I can add a timeline that gives me kind of a visual representation of these dates. And then I can simply click in here, see expenses for different time periods in my data set. So when I select different spans of time, my numbers adjust to show just that time period. I'm going to click on the Filter Clear button to clear that out. And there is a little drop down here to choose different ways to look at my filter timeline by years, quarters, months, days. The other tool I can use to filter in here is the slicer. So again, I'm going to click into my pivot table and choose Pivot Table Analyze. And this time I'm going to choose the Insert Slicer. This lets me choose any of the field or fields in my original data set and add a filter on those. I'm going to choose expense type and go ahead and click OK. And now what I get is a little tool where I can select one or more of the options here to show the values for only that expense type or types. And also turn on the multi-select tool, and then everything I click will be added to my options. Now let's look at charting. So when I have a pivot table, in the Pivot Table Analyze tool, I can add a pivot chart directly from here, and it will pull the information from my pivot table and make a chart from it. But let's show you how you can back up and create the pivot table and the pivot chart all in one step. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go back to my main data set, the Payment Data tab, and select a cell in my table. And now I'm going to go to the Insert tab, but instead of using Pivot Table, I'm going to go to the right and I'm going to choose Pivot Chart. When I click on this, similar to when I created a pivot table, it asks me what data I want to use. I want to use expense payments table and where I want to put it, and I'll choose a new worksheet and click OK. Now this time in my pivot chart tool, I get the area for my pivot table and the area for my pivot chart along with pivot chart fields. Pivot chart fields works very similar to a pivot table. You'll see the list of the fields, which is the columns in your main data, and then the window pane of where to place them. But instead of having rows and columns, you'll see the option for axis and legend. So let's see if we can chart the expense types and amounts. So what we'll do is we'll check off the amount paid, and because that's a numerical value, it's going to automatically go to values. And I'm going to see my pivot table with the sum of all the amounts in the expense amount paid. And I'll see a bar chart showing that one total. Now, again, if I want to break it down by type, similar to what I did before, I'm going to take that expense type, I'm going to drag it in so it's an axis item here. And now I will see my pivot table is broken down by type of expense, and my pivot chart now has a bar for each of those. Well, let's say instead of having a bar for each, if I want the different colors to apply to the expense, I could take the expense type and drag it up to the legend. And then I would see a different color for each category with a legend on the side. Now, if I want to have this basic structure, but I want to change it a little bit, I can go up to the toolbar and choose the Design tab. And there is a quick layout tool that lets me preview some different options and different ways to format this. And I could select an option from here. The other thing I can do is in the Design tab, I can go to change the chart type. And maybe instead of having a column chart, maybe I want a bar chart, and I can see what that would look like. And I could again try the different chart layouts here. Now you can even take this farther if you would like to add in the date or the time here. So if you take the payment date and you put it on the x-axis, so drag it into the axis, then you can actually switch this around and see over time. I'm going to actually turn this into a line chart. And then I can see this changes over time in these expenses. And on Windows, I can use these little plus buttons in my pivot chart to drill into this data to see it by quarter or by quarter and month in addition to year. So these are really powerful tools that let you, with a few clicks, see more about your data.